David, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Is that working?
Yes,
Yeah.
please, as close as possible.
Okay, that sounds good. Okay. Well, thank you, Miroslav and the Digital Innovation Pavilion for the opportunity to host this panel today. It's a real pleasure. And about 2 hours ago, I sat on a panel launching and announcing the Digital Innovation Pavilion, and really communicating the support that KPMG and its member firms brings to this topic and its interest in digital innovation and technology. So very pleased to be here. We've got a great group of panelists. I'm going to make some opening remarks, and then I'll have each of the panelists introduce themselves in turn. And then we'll have about 10 or 15 minutes for each of the panelists to speak, and then we'll open it up for any questions. Okay. So I think one of the points that I wanted to start off, just to contextualize today's panel, is we've heard a lot of terms at COP this year in terms of really moving from ambition and intent to implementation and actualization, right? Actual realization of all the commitments that have been made. And a lot of terms that have been thrown out in terms of innovation, and we're in the Digital Innovation Pavilion here, and transformation. And I think both of those words are absolutely apt. They may be overused in some contexts and in some applications, but I think in terms of the enormity that we all face in terms of the climate crisis and the need to decarbonize our societies rapidly, we really are faced with the fundamental challenge of a transformational challenge, right? And I think the topic here within the Digital Innovation Pavilion on the topic of digital is fundamental to that discussion around transformation. And when we talk about digital, we're talking about really rapid, transformative, kind of breakthrough or disruptive technologies that have really emerged over the last number of years. You could think of things like AI, blockchain, distributed ledger technologies, machine learning, advanced compute. All of these things are fundamentally changing the way in which we're able to understand the world, interact with the world, and create value. But I think also one of the challenges that's incumbent upon everyone is understanding and applying that technology in a way that's positive, that actually results in positive change, and doesn't actually achieve kind of the negative implications that may come along with that, including some of the ethical considerations around technology use. And so one of the areas that I think is really critical is the topic of trust. And when we talk about trust in relation to digital, I kind of think about trust in relation to the digital innovations themselves, but also trust in terms of the data and the information that's made available for use by those digital innovations, right? So we're talking here about things like trust in data, trust in analytics, trust in the technologies that provide the interpretive abilities to use that information to be able to create those new forms of value exchange, right? And so I think what we'd really like to focus today with this group of panelists is looking at ways to learning from their experiences and also bringing their perspectives to the table in terms of how can we enhance those positive trust dimensions, but how can we also bridge some of those trust gaps, whether that's in relation to the governance context, whether it be in relation to the technologies themselves, as well as to the broader, I've heard a lot around sectoral or multi-stakeholder collaboratives. How do we bring trust into that discussion and really ensure that as we move forward, we've got that trust basis? So with that, I'll pause there. I'll ask each of the panelists in turn to just briefly introduce themselves, and then we'll turn to our first speaker.
Thank you, David, for the introduction. I'll try to speak loud because the mic is not very loud. So my name is Thierry Watrin. I'm the Green Economy Advisor to the Minister of State of the Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning of Rwanda. and I'll speak today about the digitalization voyage of Rwanda and the link, the intertwining between the green agenda and the digitalization. Thank you.
My name is Benoit Clement. I work for Vera. I serve as their Director of Financial Innovations. Most of my work is around financial products and market strategies to scale investment in climate action and sustainable development.
My name is Kate Wharton. I'm a principal at Cross Boundary. We do investment in emerging and frontier markets, and so we'll focus on that today.
My name is Neil Cohn. I'm a co-founder of CodeGreen.org, and we are a company that's coding blockchain solutions that are hopefully will enable collaboration in the industry.
I'm Catherine Foster. I am the Executive Director of the Green Digital Finance Alliance and also one of the executive members of the Climate Change Coalition and a board member on the EIT Food and a number of other initiatives, but all working on innovation, digital, etc.
So thanks for those introductions. One thing I wanted to comment, just picking up on, I think the point I was making around the importance of the context and thinking about things, not only the technologies, but the governance, the institutional frameworks. These all need to go hand in hand. And I think the point, one of the key points there is that it's a multi-actor journey. And we need to be thinking about all the dimensions of that. And what I was quite pleased about in terms of being able to pull together this panel is I think that we've got a good representation in terms of a diversity of players and actors across what I'll call that kind of supply and demand component within the ecosystem. So really looking to understand and hear from each of our panelists in terms of their perspectives on that broad question of trust. So with that, I will turn it over to Neil, who is our first speaker.
Thank you, David. With, by the way, the best name of anyone, Green All, is pretty awesome as a name. So, yeah, really excited to be here. And I think we're at a point right now and where digital has really become a critical factor in the market. As many know, I've been in this market for about 25 years. I left traditional being to try to do something I thought was more important at that time. Try to change the world, use what I knew how to do in trading and bring it to something that was critical, to climate change, global warming, as we called it back then, really was able to benefit from market mechanisms. And, wow. In Carbon 1.0, we were really able to get money into projects. The competition back then was really about which projects could you finance, how much could you do, how do you scale. It was kind of a fun and exciting time. We were winging it. We were initially really trading moonbeams. We didn't even have all the rules yet. This is even pre-CDM's rules being finalized. So we were kind of like trading rights to future emission, reductions and credits. As that moved forward, it was quite clear in 2008 through 2010 when carbon trading really kind of hit a climate winter after Waxman-Markey did not pass and the economy fell. It was clear that if we had another bite at the apple, if we had another chance to actually do climate finance, we could do better. We could use technology. We could use IoT. We could use all of the innovations that were happening in geospatial and eventually blockchain to really try to scale and do more impactful projects. Originally, we had to do massive projects, massive forestry projects, because it was too expensive to do the validation, verification. The whole process was almost impossible for anybody, the biggest companies, to actually back a project, and they were the only beneficiaries were massive companies and governments. Under the next regime, the idea was wow, if we could really embrace these technologies and do this correctly, we could do more impactful projects. We could really reach scale. We could try to hit the points that we missed. We could really make this inclusive. We can make this more meaningful. And so about 5 years ago, I really got involved, initially looking at IoT and geospatial. Eventually, I was skeptical of blockchain. eventually embracing blockchain could do for immutable trust, as you just spoke. What happened then was, really there weren't that many people in it. I started working with the World Bank. We were able to get the Climate Warehouse, which is now being launched as the now it's called the Climate Action Data Trust. And it was really a phenomenal achievement to have the World Bank bring forward a system that has autonomous governments working on a system of trust through blockchain, to have registries all, as Vera and others, to submit their data, and to have a way to assure immutable trust and double claims, and to enable the market to start to move forward in a more decentralized approach, as Paris it was grown as a bottom-up approach versus Kyoto, which was top-down. What's happened now over the last couple of years, though, is that there's so many brilliant minds in this and so much technology that it's become more focused on which technology. It's become feudalistic as blockchains and as other techs are all getting involved. And we're starting to lose sight of where we were, where the money was really going into implementing projects, in investment. And it's like someone saying, hey, we need to move to new town, and families, but they're fighting over which car to take as opposed to where they're going. We need to focus now on getting these projects done. And I after doing the Climate Warehouse with the World Bank in Chia, it was clear to me that I needed to have a nonprofit that was tech agnostic, that was capable of trying to create this collaborative, pre-competitive foundation, so that we stopped focusing on which technology, but technologies could work together, and that we could actually get back to our common shared goal of a crisis. I mean, I'm kind of scared as I look around the COP and I see everyone. I can't tell you how many times I heard the word "I" today, and how many times I heard "we," and this attitude of like, it needs to be different. It needs to be back to like, it's a crisis. It's not about who wins getting there. We all win together. And I'm hoping that we could take a step back and think about that. And I really like what this group is doing and what Miro and Tom have created. And hopefully there's more collaboration, because that's honestly what we need. That's where I'm at.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Excellent. Thanks, Neil. Yep, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah. Kind of riffing off of Neil's point, it kind of feels like almost every week there's a new registry popping up, or a new set of standards, or, there's so many chefs in the kitchen, and we're not focused on what we're trying to get out of this entire experience. When I think about trust, and I'm looking at the opportunities that we have in front of us, I think with this kind of feudalistic, fractionalized, this fragmented approach to trying to solve these problems creates more fog and more opacity in the markets, which tends to take away market confidence. And this is creating obstacles for investors to be able to put their funds into the kinds of carbon projects that need to be taking place. And I also think that this is a really awesome opportunity for a lot of the technologies to be able to allow for greater trust to exist within these systems. There's greater opportunities for transparency. There's greater opportunities for accessibility and scale. I look at right now on the supply side of, in the context of carbon markets, we're seeing how a lot of carbon projects are struggling to get their projects off the ground. There's a lot of financial barriers. There's the issue of the registries having to do project reviews, and there's a lot of quality issues with the submissions. And I see these opportunities where digital monitoring, reporting, and verification, which could be transacted through blockchain, there could be applications of artificial intelligence to help with the digitization, the codification of methodologies, and then also all of the DMRV, the monitoring, reporting, and verification systems, feeding live data from the projects on the ground, being able to have that information be translated and analyzed immediately by the digitized methodologies, and allow for validation and verification of projects to be happening 24/7 around the clock, and not just 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, when somebody is sitting at a desk having to look at it with human eyes, which is prone to a lot of different kinds of issues. And so these are some different ways in which I think technology can also, provide that trust, allow for greater accessibility and scale. You could have participative, decentralized monitoring, reporting, and verification where the communities themselves are participating in the development, in the monitoring, the reporting, the validation and verification of these projects. So there's a whole lot of opportunity there. I remember 2 years ago, 2 summers ago, I was in East Africa in a very remote part where there was no paved roads, there was no electrical grid, no municipal waste system, but yet, these clay dwellings that had been built by hand had solar panels on them, and they were using smartphones. They had Androids, and they were charging their smartphones on these solar panels. And I was seeing how in some ways they were more advanced than some developed nations I spent time in, where they were doing cashless, digital transactions, paying each other for goods and services between each other's phones. And I think wow, if they can already leapfrog these cash-based systems, because there's no ATMs out there, there's no, huge supermarkets or anything to that effect, but they're already participating in these new advanced emerging technologies faster than some of our developed nations are. Why couldn't they be able to also participate in generating more carbon or climate-related revenues for their own communities? And I think using technologies like blockchain, DMRV systems, and artificial intelligence can allow for a lot of that accessibility to take place, allow for greater trust, greater participation at all levels. And I think that's really the direction that everything needs to go. We need to find ways to where we can integrate a lot of these technologies together and not silo ourselves and compete with one another, but rather collaborate and open this up. I'll pause there.
Thanks for those comments. And just to pick up, maybe I can kind of a common thread that I'm hearing from Neil and yourself about the importance and power of collaboration, but also what we're kind of seeing in the shakeout, that's the evolution of this marketplace. And when I think about technologies such as blockchain and the decentralized ethos that goes along with it, and the supposed democratization of access to and ability to use information, and we're kind of seeing this kind of rush into the vacuum of all of these various projects. And even on the on the DMRV side of things, we're seeing a lot of projects, a lot of that on the face of them look different, but when you actually start to scratch below the surface, there's a lot of commonality, right? So I guess an open question, whether it needs to answer it now or we leave it to the end, or if someone wants to pick it up. But Neil probably knows where I'm going with this, but yeah, which is like how what's the solution there? How do we kind of cut through this challenge that I think everyone kind of talks about, but everyone keeps kind of banging our heads around this kind of collective challenge?
Can you hear me? Yeah, there's only one key thing I wanted to say. There's been 30 years of climate negotiations. We have integrity because of Vera, because of, after Kyoto, we had to have standards that created that integrity. The idea that anyone can come in this decentralized approach and we're going to be the new authority. Decentralization is not about disintermediation of the authorities. It's about radical inclusion. And that's what we need to do. So we need to create these technologies to radically include parties from developing countries to enable that. But we cannot forget all the work that's been done.
Safeguarding mechanism.
We cannot avoid that. That is really that's the foundation. And to go back and recreate that's a disaster.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Neil. So we'll turn it over to Kate. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you so much. I'll pick up on the collaboration theme. And, as I mentioned in my introduction, my focus is really on scaling climate finance in emerging and frontier markets. So that's sort of the lens and the hat that I have on in this conversation. And I thought it might be interesting to talk a little bit about how we're using data and digital innovation in one sector in particular. Then we can also talk about carbon. That's usually the hat on, but I'll put on a different hat today. And just talk a little bit about the work that we're doing in mini grids. So as I'm sure you know, and specifically mini grids in Africa. So as I'm sure you know, huge impact both in terms of mitigation for replacing diesel, for electrifying appliances, and also for adaptation and building more resilient societies. Now, it's also the least cost way to electrify more than 250 million people in Africa. Today, we have somewhere between 3,000 to 4,000 on-site solar mini grids in Africa, and our teams estimate that by 2030, we need 140,000, which is a massive scale up, 3,000 to 140,000. We think that part of this is obviously a financing challenge, and part of this is a data problem. We have a fund that specifically invests in mini grids in Africa, but alongside that, we also have a mini grid innovation lab. The purpose of this is to improve the investability of the sector. So, one of the big challenges here is that most mini grids are very small. It's hard to invest in anything on such a small scale. And so you need that aggregation. You need to treat this as infrastructure, and you need the data to actually improve the business, the underlying business itself. And so the intention and the purpose of the innovation lab is actually to run experiments driven by data through a collaborative process in order to identify which innovations actually work and should be scaled in order to improve the investability. So we work with a wide range of mini grid developers across the continent, 7 countries, 110 different sites, at least 27 partners. A couple of those are utilities, which is interesting, and I believe they're generating more than 1 million data points every single day that are feeding into our system for analysis. And just as an example, to make it very concrete, one of the innovations we're testing, for example, is about appliance financing. If you are to give users of mini grids appliance financing, will that increase their consumption of electricity? Now that matters because you need enough of a base load in that community in order for the mini grids to be economically sufficient. Now, the way we did this is providing some grants to developers to provide that appliance financing mechanism. And what you find is that the type of appliance matters a lot. So non-productive appliances, a TV or a speaker, has no impact on energy consumption. What that means is households have a set energy budget. When they get new appliances, they're just going to change behavior within that set budget. Now, productive use appliances make a huge difference for obvious reasons. It allows you to generate additional income. So we've done a lot of experiments with mills in particular, as well as sewing machines and other things like this. And the data that's going into these experiments is coming from a number of sources. And one thing that I wanted to emphasize here is that I think there's within the digital innovation, there's obviously a lot of new technologies, new approaches, but there's also a lot that needs to be done that's very simple, from hardware and software that's already installed. So a huge source of data for our teams at the household level is smart meters. A couple years ago, we were taking Excel files from developers, talk about trust, probably less trustworthy than now the data we're getting from smart meters, which obviously makes the process significantly better, gives you better insights, and is actually real time and actionable. We're also taking data from inverters, right? So the hardware that's part of the system, converting DC to AC, that gives you system level data around performance of the hardware as you're performing experiments on that space. I'll maybe pause there a bit on mini grids, except to say maybe one other example of sort of where you can go with this. Once you have the largest repository of data on African mini grids, is to look at demand forecasting. So a huge issue in mini grid space is proper sizing of these systems. Right now, pretty consistently oversized, something like 40%. And what that means is you have very inefficient deployment of capital. You're expecting demand to be much higher, so it takes longer to get repaid on these systems. So looking at that as another way to use, again, like this is not blockchain, this is nothing fancy, this is using the data that's already there, but is incredibly impactful and can actually allow hopefully more finance to flow into these sectors. I'm also very happy to talk about the carbon side, which is usually what's top of mind, but thought a concrete example would be useful for the conversation.
Yeah. Excellent. Thanks for that, Kate. And I think just picking up on that, I think we've had comments made today, and I've heard throughout this conference around, fundamentally when we're talking about that transformational nature of the challenge, it's all about scaling. right? And we have to get at the roots of what actually intends behavioral change, right? So we have to get to those small scale solutions and get at, look at the incentives in terms of how people actually make decisions. But to your point about using and leveraging the technology is about, a couple of years ago, you said you're, Excel-based tracking mechanisms, and now you're using real-time sensors and things like that to be able to access the data. And then when we couple that with what Neil and Benoit have been talking about in terms of being able to couple that, what I'll call kind of off-chain data with the on-chain technologies and what that means in terms of verifiability and immutable trust, I think it's the combination of all things to me that's really that's the powerful opportunity here. So with that, we'll turn it over to Thierry.
Thank you, David. Thank you for the comments. It was really interesting. I find it interesting to have the mini grid point of view and the carbon point of view, because the end goal, we can hear me? The end goal, it's okay. The end goal is to be able to access a decent condition of living for developing country with the mini grid, access to electricity, and for carbon financing, finding a way of putting a positive price on biodiversity. Meaning that if you take care of your forests and your local vulnerable people, then you can find a way to be retributed for that. In Rwanda, what we've been doing, we've been developing several programs at the national level with the Ministry of Environment and the Ministry of Finance. You were talking about governance right before. What's interesting is that you need to work hand in hand, because usually, historically, the Ministry of Environment were working on the biodiversity and on the green projects. The Ministry of Finance was working on finance, right? What we've done in Rwanda, we've changed totally this paradigm and we work together. For example, my position is green economy in the Ministry of Finance. And so we've applied for some programs for carbon financing, and we're happy to have Vera or gold standard to be able to have those kind of certification for the integrity, for the MRV. But what we see for such a small country as Rwanda is very difficult to find the capacity and the number of people to apply for those kind of projects. So our access to carbon markets is limited as a matter of fact. And developing blockchain and new technology will help as well our country to be able to benefit in a larger scale for that. And for the mini grid, it's kind of the same. We have small markets in Rwanda, and not a lot of big investors want to come there. And you would have the regulator that would say we need a lot of mini grids access because they want to be sure to have no discontinuity on the network. So you end up with non-efficient mini grid solutions that have been developed for vulnerable people who ends up with a lot of solar panels that they don't use, and it's very expensive and it's not profitable and it's small. So we need to change as well this paradigm by developing data, Internet of Things, the IoT, to be able to say, okay, vulnerable people in Rwanda, they consume 50 kilowatts per day, so we need that many number of solar panel or mini grid, etc., etc. So that's how we see the digitalization of Rwanda in a very pragmatic way, and we want to make things not only profitable but attractable for the Global North company and as well for our people, because we have a lot of young investors. I live in Kigali, and I see a lot of young people with great ideas on how to do, for example, global biomethane from the food waste. We have a lot of projects, but it's very complicated to finance them because for the same reason, there is a financing gap in the technology MSMEs in Africa because of, one, the perceived risk. Most of the people in Europe or in the US would say, well, I'm not going to invest in Rwanda, it's too risky, but actually it's not that risky. And secondly, the return on investment, right? It's difficult, you need to scale really precisely to be able to have a maximized return on investment. And at the same time, you need to accept that sometimes things take time. If you want to preserve the biodiversity and the way we do things in a sustainable way, you have to accept that you cannot have a 50% return on investment on day one. So that's as well a reality that we need to take into account. And we see it in Rwanda with the difficulty of financing adaptation project versus mitigation project. Mitigation project, I can find 1,000 investors to come. Adaptation projects, well, you have a long way to go. So maybe that's those kind of things that we need to share as well and to showcase in our discussion, our panel. And in Rwanda, we're trying to move forward on the green agenda, and we're quite in front on the green economy. Just to finish with, we believe in our ministries that intertwining the digitalization and the green agenda will help both sectors to maximize each other. Because if you do it in a different way, like digitalization but without greening, it will be terrible and GHG emission will increase. But if you do it in a green way, then you will be able to help the greening of your country. We're working currently on a biodiversity index. We're working on the green GDP, which means that we're doing a natural capital counting the forests, counting the gorillas. We have a lake as well in Rwanda. We need digitalization as well, with the end goal being, okay, there's a positive price on nature, because currently the price is zero, right? You can do whatever you want. So we have a price, we have a natural capital accounting, we have a green GDP, and we're able to give the best governance to the rest of the world, but especially to the rest of Africa, because as Rwanda, where we want as well to be first comer, but to be able to teach the other and tell them, okay, that's the way to go, and to exchange, a peer-to-peer exchange. Yeah, I hope I was not too long.
No, that was excellent. Thank you, Terry. And I think the point that I'll pick up on, which is really speaking about, to the point of the Digital Innovation Pavilion and the Climate Change Coalition, is that intersection of the climate nature agenda with the digital agenda. That's what fundamentally this is all about. This is why we're having this discussion. So thank you for that. One other thing I'll just pick up before we turn it over to Catherine is I was glad that you raised adaptation finance along with the mitigation challenge, right, as well as biodiversity in the context of that. And I think I've seen some really interesting applications that bring together blockchain DLT, Earth observation satellite data, smart contracting, and really trying to challenge, essentially address and unlock and scale adaptation finance. Because I think fundamentally one of the challenges with adaptation that we all know is that benefits, accrue out into the future, right? Relative to a future, that delta, that resilience delta, is effectively somewhat unknown. And so how do we actually quantify that? How do we price that? And then how do we leverage technology to be able to actually access and capture those capital markets and those revenue streams, right? So I think fundamentally it's a challenge I've looked at for a long time. So I was glad that you raised that. So with that, I will turn it over to Catherine to wrap it all up with a vote.
Well, thank you. There's a reason I wanted to go last, to be able to reflect on some of the amazing work here, but also on 30 years of working in sustainable development and climate. I started as a diplomat. I'm an environmental scientist turned diplomat, and in the early 90s to late 90s was part of the trade agreement, side agreements, the carbon market initial discussions, and the initial global reporting index, all of this, human security, working really deeply with Rwanda. And then I became really disenchanted with policy when my own country, Canada, pulled out of Kyoto. I was sent to Washington in 2000 as the representative because we were told, Gore was going to win. The winds changed, the world changed, security changed from environment to other matters. And so this is when I turned to innovation. And it was through Climate Kick, when I was working with Climate Kick, that it started to make sense. And because we could see this type of dialogue happening, so this is a little shout out to Climate Kick, because it brought together that type of innovation, that type of multifaceted collaboration and consortia building. It had accelerators, yes, but it also did deep innovation dives where we could take a methane project, and we actually worked with solution providers who said, this is actually going to reduce methane, but now we need a standard. And so, but working with Agolin and others, being able to say, we're going to get this feed onto the market, but we need to lower the price point, because at this point, farmers aren't interested in paying more to lower methane. So let's create a standard so that we can get this in the climate market. That is how innovation happens, by bringing people together that are facing different types of barriers and brainstorming around that and actually coming up with pathways to make progress. And I wanted to reflect on that in terms of where I am now, because I went through Climate Kick for a number of years, and then I worked very deeply with emerging technology, startups, the World Bank, climate markets. And the idea, again, was how do we create access? How do we create trust? How do we bring people together? And I was always very skeptical of the notion of revolution around this, because it assumes that everyone's taking up arms and fighting a common enemy or common policy. And that's not the case. This is about building on legacy infrastructure, policy, data, connectivity, and building on models that have worked, and also addressing barriers that haven't worked. And what I wanted to also reflect on was some of the work that all of you are doing. And what I say, instead of scaling, to me, it's about integrating, aggregating, and amplification of impact. And just as some examples of what I want to be able to do with Green Digital Finance Alliance, I only started 2.5 months ago as the executive director, but I worked with them previously, because it's about building out the tools that are bridging the digital, the green, the finance, bringing in the natural capital valuation, bringing in biodiversity, thematic, food, finance, oceans, and bringing in also some of the financial mechanisms that can help. So I'm going to end on some of those, and that includes, we were one of the first to create this digital green, blockchain digital green bonds framework. It wasn't ready. There was nothing end to end. But in the 3 years since that first came out, we have progressed. So there is new models that are layering up on top of old models. We just have to keep going. And with the Bank of International Settlement last year, created a report that actually did talk about aggregating small solar or community projects into an investable fund. How can we do that? Or taking investable projects and allowing individuals access to invest. We now have the capacity. It's not just about the technology, it's about the collaboration, it's about the aggregation of models and data and capacity to be able to create these types of innovative models. That's what I want to do with the Green Digital Finance Alliance. I want to build those bridges between everything that we've talked about here today. And I think with this type of spirit of community and collaboration, we can do it.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Catherine. And I think your points, the 3 points that you made in terms of kind of bringing it all together, kind of really hit home for me. So maybe with that, I think we've got about 10 minutes or so. If there's any questions from the audience, we can take those.
Thanks, David. Richard Throlful, I lead the Infrastructure and Government Network at KPMG. I was really struck by the point you were making at the end, Kate, about the power of the data that you get off all of those mini grids. But also then thinking about Thierry's point, do we think that data needs to be opened up and held across the whole of a government? Or do we think it's more important and we'll get more innovation if we allow some of the value of that data to continue to be held in private hands?
I'm sure others on the panel often also have some thoughts around data privacy. So for us, we take an open source approach. So this is research funded by Rockefeller, Carbon Trust, others, and the intention is to open source it for the entire community. And so all of the results, I don't know if the data itself, but all of the results are open source, and it's built in collaboration with dozens of partners who are receiving that input back to inform their business model. So I think for me, it's a pretty unequivocal open source to the extent possible, and that's why I think nonprofits and such in this space also play a really important role for that.
I agree with open source systems, but there are times when the data itself may have reasons to be permissionable. And like we were doing when we built the climate warehouse, it was quite obvious that some of the projects we're looking at grazing in Mexico. And if it was clear that the geospatial information was released for a project, the cartels would go to those farmers and would actually get that money back. So there are times when data needs to be on the chain, but actually most blockchains actually have it fully open. But there are methods and technologies now where you can make it permissionable data, and that at times is very useful because a lot of data is proprietary or for security reasons needs to be open to those that need it, but only them. So it's a really interesting situation.
I want to answer that with a bit of a twist, because I think there's also often a conflation of data privacy, data transparency, and data visibility, right? And this goes back to the issues of trust. And what we're seeing are, again, pivoting around some of those barriers. And I'm thinking of a couple of projects that we're doing at GDFA, where we were thinking how, working with the EU under Horizon Grant, how can we do digital green mortgages, right? You need individual data in order to make those assessments. So we had to look at data sources. Some of them were private, couldn't access them. So what we did was pivot. We asked mobile users and energy bill providers to give us the aggregated data. And then we actually put that on an open source platform, and we actually built an open source tool recognizing it. So not only did we address the data innovation issue, but then actually recognize the issues that were being faced by those trying to access and use data. So we're building a global platform and tool that is usable and accessible and open source and crowdsourced. So to me, this is, again, it's about pivoting and finding the opportunity. It sounds a bit naive, but we're actually building it out, and it is quite viable. It's really about setting your dial and your compass and making sure that you're navigating to where you want to go in this innovation space, because it is possible.
Well, I kind of agree with what everybody said. You have in Europe the GDPRS that's protecting the people. In Africa, it will be coming very soon. We need to be careful not to make it an excuse not to develop the technologies as well, especially for Africa. I hear excuses all the time for Africa not be ready to receive funding, not having the technological knowledge or framework. So on our side, we will follow the best practices. There are some policies that exist already. For sure, we need to be careful as well with the data of the people. But we have enough development in terms of technology to cryptalize the data and be sure that normally it should not go out. For the mini grid, it can be numbers instead of name and peoples. But on our side, Rwanda will be following the best practices.
Thank you. Any more questions from the floor? Oh, okay. One comment from me, and that I mentioned in advance to all of our panelists, I was going to put them on the hot seat to leave us all with one actionable insight. So chew on that for a second while I make some comments, and then I'm going to come back to you on that. So I think the other comment that I think really resonated for me from all of the speakers is, while we are, if I go back to my opening comments around, transformation and the large scale of the systems level change that we all recognize that the climate crisis engenders. But if we look at these, when we're talking about digital, we're actually talking about quite a robust foundation of work that's already been done. Okay, so a lot of this isn't about needing to reinvent the wheel, or it's really about, I think, Catherine, your point, it's about kind of layering on and stacking on to existing technologies and things, but looking at new ways in which those can create value, whether it's through the interconnectivity. But I think also the point was made around needing to think about this. It's a systems challenge. We need to think about this through a systems lens and try and get beyond those kind of silos, right, that are really inherent from a discipline standpoint, as well as from all the various actors that are kind of coming out and trying to carve out their own little niche as part of this, right? So with that, I will maybe we'll go backwards, and maybe Catherine, I'll start with it. Oh, we do have a question. Yep.
Thank you. So, I had a question on the remuneration of the local communities, especially talking about carbon credits. So, like, going forward, what are the ways, especially also with Vera, to make sure that the local communities receive kind of what they deserve, or take as much part of the profit as the trader in between?
So I believe this mechanism is going to be made as a requirement under Article 6, but share of proceeds is something that's currently being explored at Vera, looking at how we could bring remuneration back to those communities that are building that out. There are some interesting conversations with other companies as well that I know are deploying these royalty payment mechanisms for the work that they're doing within their communities. I'm curious to explore that further and see if there are ways where similar approaches could be adopted. I think that this is really what encourages the ultimate longevity of any kind of project, and also the benefit sustainment of those projects really requires for the communities to be receiving as much of those benefits as possible, and also taking ownership and pride in those projects. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of opportunity to grow and expand in that area, and I feel like we're just at the beginning.
I love this question. So I think a couple answers from my end. So we're advising on carbon projects. So this is sort of at the point of transaction. What can you do? I think one, like you were mentioning, making sure that investors understand the value of this as well. So the fact that when communities are engaged, are properly remunerated for the hard work that they're doing on actually doing the project over 30 years, that makes a more sustainable project that reduces for companies the risk, like the execution risk of the project. And so there should be a financial value to doing that right. I think second, one of the big challenges that we see across any transaction in emerging and frontier markets, but especially in carbon, is the information asymmetries. So especially when you have investors who have no idea how a project is done on the ground, have probably never been to that country, don't have a team actually there sourcing the deal, diligencing the deal, familiar with all the local intricacies. And you have a project proponent or a developer who likewise is probably not well versed on how to access capital markets and the various investment structures that can be done. And one of the things that's challenging in this space compared to, say, renewable energy is you don't have these established structures, right? We know how to finance, a renewable energy deal. For carbon, I've seen so many different structures and so many different terms. There's not a standard yet. And so I think because of that, you often have, you run the risk of the communities involved in the project, one, not being at the table in negotiations, and two, just not knowing what the benchmarks are. And so there's a lot of need for support at the point of transaction for advisors who can serve as that neutral intermediary and make sure that you have trust and full transparency on both sides of the deal as it's being signed. And then finally, I think to the point of like data and transparency, just transparency on what are the community benefits. It is exceptionally hard to find that information anywhere. And so there's a lot of also good intention groups that want to understand, should it be 50%? Should it be 60%? Under what circumstances should I use, option A, B, and C? And like that, there's good intention, but actually understanding how to do it is also hard because this is often kept very proprietary and often intentionally so. So we are very strong advocates for it, and the fund that we're designing for investing in nature-based carbon projects, the transparency of community benefits is one aspect of that I think will have sector-wide impact.
One quick thing I want to say is obviously it's really critical to make sure, and I think digital enables a lot of the benefit to go all the way down to the all of the stakeholders, really to the smallest one. But one of the issues that I've heard is where and how are they rewarded, and I think we need to be careful not to make it on the transaction fees. I've heard many parties say we need to have like X percentage of every time it transacts go back to the originator, and while that sounds beautiful, what it does is it actually diminishes the ability for that to have any further tradability, because you know that you're going to have that chopped off every time you go down. It doesn't really work well. It doesn't work well for decentralized markets. Better mechanisms would be finding structures where some of the value goes to the stakeholders in a pre-agreed arrangement so that they have that up front. They know what they're getting. As the value of the project goes up, they could maintain that or they could sell it early. But trying to create structures where they're educated, they're able to participate, and it encourages more liquidity is great. When you're trying to do that at the wrong point in the transaction, it can actually hurt the value and lessen the overall ability to invest in those projects. So it needs to be done correctly.
Yeah. Well, in Rwanda, everything we do it to help the most vulnerable people. Just for COVID-19, we reduced the tax income for the most vulnerable people, because the cost of living after the war between Russia and Ukraine, the food, the energy, the global inflation is just unbearable. So we've done some measures. I think for the digitalization and the environment sectors, we shall encourage this policy like payment for environmental services. You may know that Costa Rica has been leading on the topic. And since then, not a lot of countries have followed. Well, I may give you a scoop. In Rwanda, we're working on that for 2023. And we're trying to make a policy to be sure that there is a minimum percentage for all of our environmental projects that goes to local communities. At the same time, it will make the investments more expensive, right? Because we want to help the most vulnerable people. So at some point, you need as well to lead by example and to say, well, if you're not ready to pay for those most vulnerable people, then don't invest your money in our country or in our continent. Something that should come from us as well. And I believe those kind of policies where we give directly to the poorest people is the way to go, because right now we've come to a situation where we see, and I live in Kigali, I can tell you, I don't need to go very far from the city to see people that are very poor and vulnerable. We need to find disruptive ways to give directly back to the people. And I think it should come from policy level and saying as well to the private sector, if you're not ready to give back and if you're here only to make profit, then you're not welcomed.
No? Okay. Any other questions? Game over. Okay. Okay. Well, with that, maybe Catherine, we'll start with you on the hot seat. Just one key actionable insight as a takeaway for the participants and for those watching via the live stream.
I don't know how actionable it is, but my insight is we have to be cautious of our definition of innovation. Innovation is a culture, as well as all of the elements that it encompasses. And we have to be careful with not imposing a predisposed notion of what innovation is.
This isn't going to be popular. I think everyone should reconsider their organization and competition is good if we're competing to achieve for climate, but if we recognize that we are leveraging climate to help our companies achieve versus leveraging technology to achieve for climate, we should think again. Because I see a lot of that going on, and I really hope that we could all reconsider where we are and find ways to really focus on how do we leverage the technology to achieve climate benefit.
Yeah, I think I would go back to maybe one of the first points I made of just look for the simple stuff. There's a lot of great things you can do today with the things that are already here. It doesn't have to be sexy.
To Neil's point, I find that a lot of the competition from these companies that are all kind of trying to reinvent the wheel, there's a lot of unique things that each of those companies I think does really well. And I think if each of these companies, kind of like to Neil's point, if we reconsidered our organization and what its purpose is, if we all decided to focus on what we did well and how we could bring that to the table as one piece of the greater puzzle and work in a collaborative manner, that's really where I think we could bring all of our strengths to accelerate the work that really needs to be done.
So I just have one sentence, right? I'll try to make it short. No, it's interesting because the Article 10 of the Paris Agreement said that innovation in clean technologies shall be engaged in the economies to fight climate change. Just developing the digitalization will reduce GHG emission by 15%. So it's really a topic that we should take seriously. I think that innovation should come directly within Africa. I'm seeing 1,000 or not 1 million of new certification for carbon markets, etc., etc. Everybody is doing their research on their own. Maybe we should try to speak together and to go directly where it's the innovation is the most needed, and to help to fight climate change.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that. Maybe if we have no further questions, maybe I'll just make some concluding remarks. So going back to my opening remarks in terms of the theme of this panel and really focusing on trust, and it's kind of trust in digital, but also trust in digital for sustainability and climate, but also trust in sustainability and climate for data. So it's fundamentally about those components of the data, the analytics, the technology, but it's also those broader components that we need to think around in terms of the governance. And I've heard about what I'll just simplify as governance, a multi-scale kind of tiered approach to governance, kind of thinking about that and the importance of collaborations and breaking down those silos. But also, I think the point that was made that there's a lot to build on. And we don't need to reinvent that. We should really be looking at the Okay, you can hear me now? Okay. So just to sum up, looking for those opportunities for collaboration. So with that, I'd like to thank our panelists today and look forward to continuing the collaboration and the discussion under the auspices of the Climate Change Coalition and the Digital Innovation Pavilion. Thanks very much.
Thank you, David.
It keeps dying on.
Oh, let me share.